Welcome back to the channel, family. Today we're going to be tackling one of the most misunderstood books in the entire New Testament, the book of Revelation. Before we can talk about what Revelation gets wrong, we need to be clear about what kind of book it is. Revelation is an apocalypse, which means it belongs to a genre of coded vision literature meant to unveil what is really happening behind the visible world, especially behind empire, power, and oppression. It's not written like a modern news report or a journalistic forecast of future events. That distinction matters because much of modern Christian prophecy culture treats its symbols as if they were literal surveillance footage of the end of the world, rather than symbolic, politically charged imagery meant to communicate meaning to its original audience. Just as important, Revelation was written into a local historical crisis, not directly to a 21st century global audience. The book presents itself as a circular message addressed to seven real communities in Roman Asia, communities living under the pressures of Roman political power and the expectations of civic religion, including the imperial cult. In other words, it begins as a text for specific people facing specific social and political tensions, not as a universal code book for modern headline reading. That historical setting is essential because when we ignore it, the book becomes easy to detach from its original purpose and repurpose for fear, speculation, and control. A major part of modern revelation panic is not simply the result of what the text itself says, but of how later Christianity redefined key words and then treated those redefinitions as if they were the original, divinely authorized meanings. In other words, many believers are not reacting to revelation on its own terms. They're reacting to a theological dictionary that was built long after the text and then enforced through doctrine, preaching, and community pressure. Once a religious culture controls the meaning of its core vocabulary, it can also control how people interpret reality. Take the word apocalypse itself. The Greek apocalypsis means unveiling or revelation, the uncovering of what is hidden. It does not inherently mean the end of the world. Yet, in modern Christian culture, apocalypse has been transformed into an end times disaster category. Collapsing skies, global destruction, prophetic timelines, and rapture charts. What began as a word about disclosure and symbolic unveiling has been turned into a synonym for catastrophe. That shift is not just a harmless misunderstanding, it is a semantic takeover that changes how people emotionally and intellectually approach the book. The same pattern appears in other words that shape Christian imagination. World, which in biblical usage can carry a range of meanings such as order, system, or age, often gets flattened into planet Earth or human culture in general, making the world a catch all label for whatever leadership wants people to distrust. Faith, which originally carries strong connotations of trust, loyalty, and relational commitment, is often redefined as belief without evidence so that certainty becomes virtue and doubt becomes sin. Flesh, which often points to a human ethical or behavioral orientation, gets reduced to the body, sexuality, or desire itself, breeding suspicion toward embodiment and pleasure. Worship, which is more fundamentally about allegiance and practice, is often narrowed into a music set, an emotional state, or a performance of devotion. Even spiritual, which can refer to inner life, moral formation, or a way of being shaped, is often redefined to mean supernatural, allowing feelings and impressions to override evidence under phrases like, I feel led. The deeper issue is not just that the meanings change, but that these new meanings become tools of social enforcement. Once a community redefines a word, it can use that redefinition to discipline people. Your worldly no longer simply describes participation in a broader social order, it becomes a coded accusation of disloyalty. You lack faith no longer means a strained relationship of trust, it means you asked too many questions or demanded evidence. That's flesh no longer names an ethical impulse, it becomes a way to make ordinary humanity seem suspect. This is apocalyptic, no longer signals unveiling or deep symbolic crisis. It becomes a cue to panic, suspend reflection, and accept authority. In this way, language becomes a mechanism of control. Redefine the word, and you redefine the boundaries of acceptable thought. This is especially important with Revelation because Revelation is already an intense, symbol heavy text. Once you read it through this modern Christian dictionary instead of its historical and literary setting, the book becomes a machine for producing constant emergency, where everything feels like a sign that collapse is near. It creates authority inflation, where believers feel they need special interpreters to decode the symbols for them. It opens the door to moral permission for cruelty because terrifying imagery can be reframed as righteous if God will do worse. And it becomes a powerful tool for political mobilization through fear because people who are trained to see the world through distorted religious definitions are easier to organize around threats, enemies, and panic. That is why this point matters so much. Christian culture did not just interpret Revelation, it changed the dictionary, and then it often punished people for refusing to use the new definitions. Now, another major issue with Revelation is the problem of authorship and identity. The book identifies its speaker simply as John, a figure exiled on Patmos, but it never explicitly says, I am John the Apostle. Now, that matters because later Christian tradition often collapses this John into the disciple John, the author of the Gospel of John, or some unified apostolic figure, even though the text itself does not make that claim. Modern reference works like Encyclopedia Britannica explicitly note that Revelation gives no indication that John of Patmos and John the Apostle are the same person, which means the book begins with a fundamental ambiguity about who is actually speaking. That ambiguity becomes even more significant when you consider that some scholarship does not treat Revelation as one seamless heavenly dictation, but as a work that appears to be a collection of separate units brought together into a single composition. Britannica describes Revelation as a text that appears to be a collection of separate units composed by unknown authors in the late first century, even though it presents itself as coming from an individual named John, which at this moment could be a rando. That means the book may not only have an uncertain identity attached to its author, but may also reflect layered composition rather than one singular, transparent voice. If divine inspiration is supposed to rest on clear authorship, stable identity, and a direct line of authority, then Revelation starts off with a problem. Before you even get to the visions, the source itself is already blurred. A major technical problem in Revelation is its repeated language of imminence. The dating of the book is debated. Many scholars place it in the late first century, often in the reign of Domitian, while earlier proposals also exist. But whatever date one prefers, the book itself consistently frames its message as something urgent and near at hand. Britannica describes Revelation as a work associated with the last quarter of the first century, and even its broader treatment of biblical literature notes that the book addresses a persecuted church awaiting an end time expected in the near future. Now, that matters because Revelation does not present its visions as distant abstractions. It repeatedly tells its audience that these are things that must happen soon and that the time is near. Even conservative commentaries that defend the book still have to acknowledge that Revelation uses explicit urgency language in places like its opening and closing chapters. The issue then is not whether the book sounds urgent, it clearly does. But what do we do with the text that was structured to create immediate expectation in its first hearers and has now been stretched across nearly 2,000 years of reinterpretation and rescheduling? Revelation reads like a book built to make its original audience feel that history was about to break open around them, not like a document designed to sustain endless deadline extensions across centuries. Once that urgency is repeatedly postponed, the theology does not simply disappear. It mutates into what we could call deadline theology, a way of living in permanent emergency mode. In social and psychological terms, that trains people to normalize anxiety, remain highly susceptible to fear based authority, and interpret ordinary political or cultural change as evidence that collapse is always right around the corner. Because of that, one of the most important things to highlight is not just that Revelation uses urgent language, but that the long term acceptance of repeatedly delayed urgency can reshape people into communities that are always bracing for the end and therefore easier to mobilize through panic. Oh, we're not finished yet. Another major place where modern readings of Revelation break down is in the treatment of the beast number. Popular prophecy culture often presents 666 as if it were a pristine, timeless, divinely fixed code that points straight to some future Antichrist technology. But the textual history itself complicates that immediately. Ancient manuscript evidence includes a real variant. Some early witnesses read 616 instead of 666. Encyclopedia Britannica notes that while the number is usually known as 666, The earliest extant written copies of Revelation gives the number as 616. That alone undercuts the idea that this is a perfectly preserved single cipher handed down from heaven without variation. Once you take the historical context seriously, the strongest explanation is not that the number secretly predicts microchips, credit cards, barcodes, or some modern tracking system, but that it functions as a coded political reference. A broad scholarly consensus ties the number specifically to the name Nero Caesar, and that reading the Hebrew Aramaic form of Neron Caesar adds up to 666, while a slightly different spelling, corresponding more closely to the Latin form Nero Caesar, adds up to 616. That's why the variant matters. It doesn't weaken the Nero reading, it actually helps explain it. The textual difference makes sense if ancient readers and scribes were working across different spelling and language conventions. That means the number of the beast works less like a universal end times fingerprint and more like a coded anti imperial signal embedded in the political world of early Christians living in the shadow of Rome. Its meaning depends on translation choices, transliteration, letter values, and spelling variants. In other words, on specific linguistic mechanics. And that is the exact opposite of how modern prophecy culture usually treats it. Instead of recognizing it as a historically situated code tied to Roman political memory, modern readers flatten it into a mystical number that can be endlessly projected onto whatever contemporary fear object is available. So, one of the strongest technical points is this: the beast number is not compelling evidence of supernatural prediction. It is a highly context dependent ancient cipher. And the moment you ignore those mechanics, you stop reading the text historically and start using it as a fear generator. A historically grounded reading of Revelation's mark language makes far more sense in the world of Roman imperial power than in modern futuristic speculation. In Revelation 13, the mark is tied directly to the ability to buy or sell, which points to a system where economic participation is linked to public loyalty. Bible Odyssey explains that the imagery of the beast and its mark is best understood against the backdrop of Roman imperial ideology and emperor worship, where political power, civic religion, and social belonging were tightly intertwined. That means that the real threat in the text is not primarily about some distant technology being implanted into human bodies. It's about economic exclusion for nonconformity, the pressure placed on people who refuse to participate in the rituals, loyalties, and symbolic behaviors required by the dominant order. Even standard historical notes on Revelation 13 connects the buying and selling language to the pressure of urban business life, where participation in economic networks could involve compromising with imperial or idolatrous systems. In that sense, the mark functions less like a sci fi device and more like a symbol of enforced allegiance within a social and economic regime. This is what makes the passage sociologically important. Revelation presents a world in which belonging, access, and survival are conditioned on visible conformity, and that naturally sharpens us versus them identity boundaries. The faithful are those who refuse the system. Everyone else becomes part of the beast order. That framework is powerful because it turns ordinary participation in public life into a test of spiritual loyalty. Once that logic is accepted, it becomes easy to reinterpret almost any social conflict as proof that one side is righteous and the other side is corrupted by the system. That is also why this imagery is so easily repurposed in modern culture war thinking. Once believers are trained to see commerce, institutions, or public participation through the lens of the mark, nearly any compliance expectation, a policy, a payment method, a civic norm, even a technological change can be recast as a spiritual loyalty test. Historically, the passage makes the most sense as a critique of imperial pressure in the Roman world, but in modern hands, it often becomes a reusable template for panic, suspicion, and boundary policing whenever people feel that the surrounding culture is demanding too much conformity. One of the deepest internal tensions in Revelation is that it presents itself as a message of hope for a threatened community, yet it does so through imagery that can easily transform victimhood spirituality into domination spirituality. The book centers the Lamb as the object of worship and portrays the faithful as those who endure suffering under hostile powers, which is one reason modern scholarship often reads Revelation as a first century work addressed to vulnerable Christian communities under the pressure of Roman imperial culture. At that level, the book can be read as resistance literature. It comforts people who feel outnumbered, compromised, or under siege. But the comfort it offers is bound up with a violent imaginative world in which enemies are not merely corrected, they are judged, crushed, cast out, and symbolically dehumanized. Revelation's own imagery moves from persecuted endurance to visions of divine retaliation, cosmic warfare, and final destruction, including scenes where the wrath of the Lamb becomes part of the moral architecture of the story. That creates a serious ethical contradiction, a Game of Thrones season 8 level plot twist, if you will. A text written to help people resist empire can also train them to long for a future in which their enemies are annihilated in the name of righteousness. In that sense, Revelation does not merely console the oppressed, it can also cultivate a triumph fantasy where suffering becomes morally meaningful because it promises eventual domination. That is what makes this such an important point to outline. A book written to resist empire can later become a book used to justify empire. Once a persecuted minority becomes culturally dominant, the same symbolic logic can be turned outward. If the faithful are always the righteous remnant and their enemies are always agents of evil, then the book's violence can be repurposed to bless the very kinds of power it may have once challenged. Even scholarly discussions of Revelation's nonviolent witness often note that its message is still embedded in violent language and divine judgment imagery, which means that the line between resisting violence and sanctifying it is far thinner than many believers assume. The social implication is profound. Revelation can normalize a moral logic that says if God will destroy them later, we can tolerate cruelty toward them now. It teaches people to see harshness as temporary alignment with a larger divine plan rather than as a betrayal of compassion. Once that reasoning takes hold, empathy becomes easier to suspend because violence is no longer just violence, it's rebranded as justice and progress. Revelation doesn't only raise questions about what God will do, it also raises questions about what kinds of people communities become when they are formed by a vision where being wounded today is spiritually linked to being vindicated through someone else's destruction tomorrow. This brings us to another major problem in Revelation: the way divine justice is presented as spectacle. The book doesn't simply describe judgment in abstract moral terms, it stages it in scenes of plagues, bowls of wrath, cosmic warfare, and mass destruction that are meant to reassure the faithful that their enemies will be dealt with. In that sense, the violence is not incidental to the message. It is a part of the emotional architecture of the book. The faithful are invited to see these scenes not merely as tragic necessities, but as evidence that justice is finally arriving. That turns judgment into a kind of vindication theater where the suffering of the outsiders becomes part of the comfort offered to the insiders. Now, this matters because repeated exposure to that kind of imagery does something psychologically and socially. It can train people toward catastrophizing, where the mind becomes conditioned to expect collapse, punishment, and dramatic conflict as the natural shape of history. It can also train people to confuse moral disgust with discernment, so that feeling repulsed by others begins to feel like spiritual clarity rather than emotional conditioning. Over time, it can even create a kind of reward anticipation around the suffering of enemies, the emotional logic of finally they'll get what they deserve. That is one of the darkest implications of the book's imagery. It can condition people not just to accept violent judgment, but to find emotional satisfaction in imagining it. That's how revenge becomes worship. Revelation takes impulses that might otherwise be recognized as anger, resentment, or vengeance and places them inside a sacred frame. Revenge no longer feels like revenge. It feels righteous. It feels holy. It feels like confidence in a divine justice. And when a community is shaped by that kind of imagination, it becomes much easier for people to see cruelty as faithfulness, hostility as moral seriousness, and the destruction of others as part of the beauty of God's final victory. Now let's talk about the problem of scapegoat language, the kind of rhetoric that does more than criticize opponents, it marks them as spiritually polluted, deceptive, or aligned with cosmic evil. One of the clearest examples is the phrase synagogue of Satan in Revelations chapter 2 and chapters 3. Bible Odyssey notes that these passages have long been read as anti Jewish, even though many scholars argue the targets may not simply be Jews in a broad ethnic or religious sense, but a specific local conflict being expressed through hostile polemic. Still, whatever its original scope, the phrase itself is severe and has a dangerous afterlife because it links a human group to satanic identity. Language like this does not stay safely locked inside the first century. Once a sacred text teaches believers to describe opponents in metaphysical terms rather than human terms, it creates a template for treating outgroups as more than mistaken. They become contaminated, fundamentally deceptive, or even agents of evil, which we see this playing out today. Scholarly work on Revelation has long noted that the book uses vilification as a part of how it defines the faithful community over against its rivals. When that kind of boundary marking is canonized, it can be lifted out of its original context and used far beyond whatever local dispute may have first produced it. The long shadow of that kind of rhetoric is especially serious because anti Jewish readings of Christian texts have repeatedly fed broader patterns of anti Semitism, which Britannica defines as hostility or discrimination directed toward Jews. Even if some interpreters argue that Revelation's specific phrase was aimed at a narrower conflict, the wording itself has been historically available for weaponization, and that is a part of the ethical problem. When opponents are pre labeled as demonic, later readers do not need much imagination to turn suspicion into hatred. This is also why Revelation's rhetoric maps so easily onto modern conspiracy culture. Conspiracy thinking thrives on narratives that sort people into hidden forces of good and hidden forces of evil, where opponents are not just wrong, but secretly controlled by dark powers. A text that already trains readers to see enemies as part of a cosmic plot gives that mindset a ready made vocabulary. So the modern implication is not just that Revelation contains harsh polemic, it's that Revelation can help normalize a habit of thought where disagreement is recoded as spiritual warfare. And when that takes root, it becomes much easier for communities to treat human opponents as if they're embodiments of evil rather than people to be understood, challenged, or corrected. Another important point is that Revelation did not glide effortlessly into the canon as an obvious, universally embraced text. Its reception in early Christianity was uneven, debated, and at times uncertain. Encyclopedia Britannica notes that by the middle of the fourth century, agreement on the New Testament canon was approaching, but not yet quite universal, which means that the boundaries of the canon were still being worked out rather than simply assumed. The Bible did not drop from heaven as a finalized table of contents. It emerged through a long historical process of selection, argument, and consolidation. Now, this is where Eusebius is especially useful. As a fourth century church historian, he gives us a window into how early Christians categorized books, including those that were considered disputed rather than automatically accepted. Britannica specifically notes that Eusebius felt free to use disputed writings authoritatively, which shows that in this period, canon and authority were not yet identical concepts. In other words, a book could be valued, cited, or used in church life even while its exact canonical standing remained unsettled. That alone complicates later assumptions that Revelation status was always obvious and uncontested. The larger implication is that Revelation's place had to be stabilized through history, not merely recognized as self evident. Even broad summaries of the canonization process show that the now standard New Testament list only appears clearly in Athanasius' 39th Festal letter in 36:7 CE, and that other traditions still persisted afterward. So, if Revelation were as plainly and unquestionably God breathed, as later believers often claim, it becomes fair to ask then why did it require so much wrestling, sorting, and gradual consensus to secure its place? One of the reasons Revelation has had such staying power is because its symbolism is elastic. The beast, Babylon, the Antichrist, the falling world order, these images are vague enough, dramatic enough, and emotionally charged enough to be mapped onto almost any era's villains. That means every generation can be told, no, this time it's really happening. This is who the beast really is. This is the system God is about to judge. And because the symbols are so adaptable, the book becomes endlessly reusable, not just for teaching, but for fundraising, mobilization, fear management, and control. That creates a powerful structural incentive. The more anxious people become, the more likely they are to cling to authority, to stay close to the voices claiming that they know what the signs mean, and to depend on the special interpreters who can decode the headlines for them. When predictions fail, the system does not collapse, it recalibrates. The date changes, the villain changes, the chart gets updated, the warning gets intensified. And because the next explanation is always presented as being just around the corner, people are trained to tolerate repeated failure as part of the process. That's why Revelation has been so uniquely profitable in religious culture, not just financially, but socially and psychologically. It doesn't only function as a book in the hands of fear based religion, it becomes a scalable and sustainable business model. Believing Revelation as a literal, divinely scripted map of reality can have real effects on a person's mental and emotional life. It can function as a kind of anxiety training, conditioning people to live in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning for threats, reading ordinary events as ominous signs, struggling to rest, and becoming fixated on doom. When your imagination is shaped by a world that is always on the edge of catastrophe, it becomes difficult to simply live in the present. Peace starts to feel irresponsible, and calm can even feel like a lack of discernment. It can also create a deep kind of moral injury. If you're told that the universe is ultimately governed by a good and loving God, but that same story ends in mass destruction, cosmic violence, and the slaughter of those outside the fold, it creates a serious internal contradiction. Many people resolve that tension by dulling their empathy or by turning the lost into a category of people who no longer feel fully human. Instead of wrestling with the cruelty of the outcome, they learn to call it justice and train themselves not to feel too much about it. Over time, that doesn't just shape theology, it shapes morality. On top of that, revelation can distort a person's sense of identity. If faithfulness is constantly linked with persecution, rejection, and opposition, then conflict itself can begin to feel like proof that you're right. Being misunderstood becomes a badge of honor. Being challenged becomes evidence that you're righteous. This creates a dangerous self concept where tension in relationships is not something to examine, heal, or repair, but something to wear as validation. That pattern becomes a recipe for chronic relational warfare because every disagreement can be recast as confirmation that you are one of the faithful standing against a hostile world. Belief in the end times does not stay in the realm of private spirituality. It reshapes how people think about politics, responsibility, and the future. If people are convinced that the world is about to end, then long horizon ethical concerns, things like protecting the environment, strengthening institutions, investing in education, or building sustainable communities, can start to feel spiritually optional. Why pour energy into repairing a world you believe is about to be destroyed? That kind of thinking creates short termism, where urgency replaces stewardship and immediate ideological battles matter more than the long term health of society. It also creates a dangerous permission structure for authoritarianism. When people are trained to see the world as a cosmic battle between God's side and the beast system, strongman leaders can be reframed as necessary weapons in that fight. A leader does not need to be morally healthy, compassionate, or even consistent. They only need to appear powerful enough to oppose the right enemies. In that framework, cruelty can look like courage, domination can look like righteousness, and abuse of power can be excused as part of God's larger plan. That is one of the most socially destabilizing effects of apocalyptic belief. It can make people more willing to trade ethics for perceived protection. On top of that, end times thinking tends to fracture communities from the inside. It intensifies boundary policing, where the central question becomes who is truly faithful and who has been compromised. People begin sorting each other into categories: who's real, who's deceived, who's worldly, who's Babylon. Instead of building trust, nuance, and shared responsibility, the culture becomes more suspicious, more combative, and more obsessed with purity. In that environment, disagreement stops being a normal part of communal life and starts being treated as evidence of corruption. The result is a society that becomes easier to divide, easier to manipulate, and far less capable of working together for anything larger than survival and ideological control. I share the impacts of these beliefs on society because it is imperative that we understand that it's not only believers who are vulnerable to these impacts. We have all been shaped by society. One of the deepest sociological problems in Revelation is that it fuses ultimate intimacy with ultimate domination. The community is imagined as the bride, and the book's climatic imagery combines wedding feast language, covenant language, and the symbolism of sacred union with scenes of violent judgment, blood, and mass destruction. That combination sends a powerful social message. What is being celebrated as the triumph of love is inseparable from the destruction of enemies. And that world, love wins, does not simply mean healing, peace, or reconciliation. It means the secure union of the faithful through the defeat, humiliation, and elimination of those outside the circle. That fusion is not harmless symbolism. It teaches a model of love in which devotion is defined by loyalty to power and where violence can be framed as necessary proof that the beloved community has finally been secured. Now, this matters because wedding language already carries enormous social meaning. Weddings symbolize belonging, exclusive loyalty, shared identity, permanence, and the formation of an us that is meant to endure. When that imagery is paired with blood soaked victory, love is subtly recoded. It stops being centered on care, mutuality, and human flourishing, and instead becomes centered on allegiance to a conquering authority. In that environment, communities can begin to absorb the idea that devotion is proven by taking the right side in a violent moral universe. Love becomes less about how you treat people and more about how faithfully you align yourself with the victorious power. The social result is a culture where love is measured through obedience and compassion for outsiders can easily be interpreted as compromise, softness, or disloyalty, which we're even seeing in many humanist circles. This dynamic is strengthened by the fact that Revelation wraps violence in ritual and celebration. Sociologically, ritual does not just express values, it helps make them feel morally binding. When a community treats something as sacred, it becomes harder to question. So, when judgment is framed through songs, feast, worship, and celebration, violent imagery is not merely presented, it's sanctified. The destruction of enemies is woven into the emotional experience of divine victory. That means cruelty is no longer experienced as something tragic that happens to be tolerated. It can now be experienced as holy, righteous, and even beautiful. Once violence is ritualized in that way, people are not just taught that destruction will happen, they are taught to feel that the destruction is part of what makes the final outcome worthy of celebration. It also creates stronger in group cohesion by building identity around a shared enemy story. Apocalyptic thinking already sharpens the line between who is inside and who is outside, who belongs and who is doomed. But when that boundary making is tied to wedding imagery, outsiders are not simply framed as mistaken or morally lost, they become threats to the union itself, enemies of the beloved community's final security. That intensifies paranoia, purity policing, and betrayal narratives. It makes people more likely to suspect false believers, compromised leaders, corrupted institutions, or anyone who appears to threaten the group's sense of sacred identity. The result is that relationships across boundaries become morally suspicious by default. Instead of difference being something to navigate, it becomes something to fear. The gendered symbolism of Revelation deepens this problem even further. The book often operates through a polarized female coded system. On one side, the bride, the pure and holy figure. On the other side, Babylon, the corrupted and condemned figure, often cast in sexualized terms. When violence clusters around that contrast, it does more than create literary tension. It teaches community to interpret belonging, purity, and betrayal through sexualized and gendered imagery. Socially, that can make purity feel political rather than personal. It turns women's bodies and sexuality into symbolic battlegrounds for communal honor and encourage people to read unfaithfulness through the lens of sexual contempt. Over time, this can normalize misogynistic patterns where pure bride and dirty whore become spiritual categories, allowing contempt for women, sexuality, or perceived impurity to masquerade as moral seriousness. This kind of imagery can also model an abusive relationship with authority. Put bluntly, Revelation can teach that the ideal lover, husband, or divine ruler is also the one who destroys the enemies of the beloved, and that the proper response of the faithful is worship and adoration. That creates a disturbing overlap with coercive relational systems where violence is recast as proof of devotion. It mirrors the logic that says he hurts them because he loves us, or his severity proves his commitment, or questioning him is disloyal. When people are formed by a sacred story in which ultimate love is paired with annihilating power, they can become more tolerant of domination in churches, families, and politics. If the most sacred love story they know teaches them that love and destruction belong together, then coercion can start to feel not just acceptable, but normal. From there, the book can produce a kind of moral inversion. Once the wedding, the union, and the triumph of the faithful are treated as the highest possible good, anything that delays judgment can be made to look like an obstacle to love itself. Mercy can start to feel like weakness. Empathy can look naive. Peacemaking can be reinterpreted as siding with the enemy. In that emotional world, people can be trained to feel that the crushing of enemies is not only justified, but necessary for the final security of the beloved community. That is one of the darkest implications of this framework. It teaches people to experience compassion as suspect and to feel emotionally aligned with violence because violence is presented as the condition for sacred union. And because Revelation gives this logic a powerful symbolic vocabulary, it creates a durable template for political dehumanization. Opponents can be cast as Babylon, the beast, or agents of Satan. And once they are placed into those categories, they are no longer treated as neighbors, rivals, or even ordinary human beings with whom one might just disagree. They become embodiments of corruption and threats to the sacred order. That makes contempt feel justified and escalation feel responsible. Reconciliation begins to look like compromise, dialogue begins to look like betrayal, and the result is a social imagination that intensifies polarization and trains communities to see dehumanization not as a moral failure, but as a faithful response to evil. In the end, Revelation does not merely depict violence, it romanticizes it by placing wedding language, intimacy, celebration, and blood in the same symbolic frame. And when a community calls that vision divine, it can train people to confuse love with domination, loyalty with cruelty, and celebration with someone else's destruction. This doesn't just apply to Christians or religious people. Thank you for sticking around to the end. Have you enjoyed this series? Believe it or not, I'm not done. I have a few more in mind to tackle before I'm done. Over the next few weeks, keep an eye out for everything wrong with the histories, the prophets, and the Psalms. And yikes, we're going there. We're also working behind the scenes to turn these into deep dive courses for students of deconstruction, literary criticism, and people centric leaders who want to learn not just how to expose harm, but to counter it as well. Now, we're still well away from the release of the courses, but two of the student workbooks are already available on Windows Shop. Everything Wrong with Genesis and Everything Wrong with Exodus. Now, a student workbook is a guided companion for anyone unpacking how the Bible shapes identity, morality, and institutions. Written for deconstructing thinkers, small groups, and even facilitators, our workbooks break the subject into course ready modules, psychological insights, sociological analysis, a glossary, curated study resources, and discussion plus capstone prompts. You can use it as a self study guide or as the backbone for group discussions or mastermind modules that rebuild epistemic confidence, moral agency, and community without authoritarian frameworks. If those type of resources are something you're looking for, head over to Windows Shop and start exploring the catalog today. Also, starting in the month of March, we're unveiling our Shop Responsibly initiative. I'm really excited about this. Windows Shop isn't just a marketplace where you can find helpful resources and dope merch in support of the channel. We also have a mission to make a difference in the world that we live in and share. And every week, my inbox is filled with requests from individuals and communities who are in need of more than just advice. So, moving forward, a portion of all proceeds from every purchase at Windows Shop will be donated directly to a family in need or a small organization doing vital community work. Whether you grab a digital download to help your own journey or some merch to rep the mission, you are now directly helping us support someone else who needs it. This is how we decrease harm and increase well being together. Shop responsibly this March. That's all I have for you today. Until next time, keep rising.